We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio, where we're taking a brief detour to discuss two of the biggest events of last week, namely President Biden's plans for further vaccine rollouts and the ongoing war on guns. To help us sift through the legal molasses is Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Esquire. Thank you for taking the time to join with us, Scott.
Thank you, Mark.
So there are some big issues I want to discuss with you today. The first is that President Biden's announcement that he intends people presumably employed at the federal or state level to go door to door in order to increase vaccination take-up. He said, I'll give you a quote here, "We need to go community by community, neighborhood by neighborhood, and oftentimes door to door, literally knocking on doors." End quote. Now, many folks have concerns about this. Firstly, does this mean that some kind of federal register will be in place regarding people's vaccination status?
Well, first, let me just say how warm it feels to be embraced by Biden's loving hands and concern, and to know that federal agents will soon be knocking on all our doors to inquire about our well-being.
It had to happen at some point, Scott.
It's such a comfort. Well, no, there is no federal vaccine database, nor will there be, nor can there be. Not everybody's vaccination has been recorded in any form that could be reliably, placed in a database or not. They could have potentially meted them out that way, but they obviously didn't, and thankfully so. And so I think the ship's out of the, it sailed. I was going to say the ship's out of the barn by that point, mixing my metaphors.
So if this were to actually be implemented without major legal challenges, it would be literally a question of people turning up in an area, just for example, Philadelphia, and going neighborhood by neighborhood, knocking on every single door.
Let's make it Cleveland, please. Come on, I got family in Philadelphia.
Let's say Cleveland.
Yeah.
So they would literally be...
As I understand it, Mark, I'll just tell you what I think it is they're going to identify where there's hot spots by zip code, and then they'll kind of flood that zip code with people knocking on doors, passing out flyers, and kind of harassing people generally with just information and bother, rather than kind of a more heavy-handed presence that, naturally some people like myself ordinarily go to when they hear about people knocking on doors from the government. But it seemed like it was just more of an informational campaign and awareness kind of effort.
Okay, now this has actually raised quite a lot of heckles in the United Kingdom, my home country, because all these people who will be coming around the doors offering advice on vaccinations or encouraging the take-up of vaccinations, they're actually asking about your health status. Now, in the UK, that's an offense to ask about or to inquire about someone's health status in an official capacity. Are there any laws regulating this kind of thing in the US?
Well, there's all kinds of laws that regulate it. And what can be asked, by whom, and when and how is all very fact-specific and jurisdiction-specific. So depending on the nature of who the parties are, employer, employee, independent contractor, and in what state they may exist in, I think those are all relevant. And I only know a little bit about this. There's more to know than this person can sort of get under his lid to understand all these different issues. Everybody's kind of working this out as it goes, Mark. When can you ask? Can you require a vaccination for certain things? It's still an experimental. That's the status that it has. It's not safe and effective for ordinary use. Like, for instance, the measles vaccine. It is only allowed to be issued under these special rules. So that's kind of another layer. Could you require a vaccine generally? Can you require one that hasn't been proven safe and effective under sort of general use guidelines? We're going to have to wait and see how the courts treat all these issues.
Yeah, now, I may not be alone in feeling this, and I'm sure I'm not, but I don't want people from the government, local or national, to come to my door and start asking me questions about any topic. As Ronald Reagan once said, the scariest words in the English language, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. That seems to have been flipped on the head by President Joe Biden. Help is on its way. How do you think this will be received by Americans?
Well, Mark, it's disappointing to hear your cynicism when it comes to these bodies that are there to help us and guide us. Yeah, of course, it's a hateful thing, and Biden's a statist, so those are not scary words. for him to hear, because he's the one who's sending the people to go knock. He's not the one cowering behind the door waiting to hear what awful program will strip them of their rights or their fortune, as the rest of us are. So yeah, it's a horror show.
Okay, Scott, let's move briefly on to the second topic that's really started to make some headlines. And this is New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's emergency declaration on gun violence. Now,
Hot off the presses.
absolutely. What does this involve, and what powers does such a declaration grant him as governor?
Well, the key issue that we're talking about here, Mark, is the legal liability of gun manufacturers, gun sellers, ammunition manufacturers, and ammunition sellers. And I think there are probably other classes as well that I'm forgetting. But what the governor announced was a sort of package of things. There were executive orders, programs, and signing of new legislation. It's this new legislation that addresses that liability issue for those involved in the gun or ammunition business that is the most odious to the Constitution, and like that's the big blinking kind of issue that he led with. And what that does, Mark, is it just gives them the right to sue. So it gives anybody in New York and any town attorney and the attorney general of the state of New York the legal right to sue a gun. So I'm actually going to take a minute here to kind of go into who they can sue, because it's so broad. It's not just any gun manufacturer. It's not just any gun seller or importer or retailer. It is also any ammunition manufacturer, seller, dealer, or retailer. So if there's a gun dealer, for instance, or if there's a gun manufacturer in Texas, for instance, that sells all their firearms to a distributor in Ohio, consistent with the federal law, and then that distributor in Ohio decides to send them to retailers in New York State, all consistent with federal and state law, both in Ohio and in New York, that is not a sufficient cover for them for being sued by a person in New York who may be the family member of someone who was shot with one of those firearms. That's how tangential it could be. And then let's add one other layer, which is the same thing could be said for the ammunition that was used.
Let's jump into a quick example here, Scott. Now, let's say, for example, just choosing a random New Yorker, Letitia James, the Attorney General, just at random, because we know she has no fingers in pies as far as gun rights go. If she decided to, for example, sue a Texas gun manufacturer that provides their guns to a distributor in Ohio, who then sells the guns to a retailer in New York, she has now, under these emergency declarations, she now has standing to sue the Texas manufacturer. Is that correct?
Well, it's not just standing. The cause of action itself was created by this new law. So standing concerns who can sue somebody for something. While she is granted standing under the law, the cause of action itself is brand new and arises under this brand new law, in, by the way, contravention to the federal law that requires basically the gun, both gun manufacturers, gun sellers, all the people kind of listed in who would be covered under this new law enjoy liability protection from this. So there's a specific federal law that grants those folks protection from this kind of law. And it's going to be challenged under that federal law. If that challenge isn't being filed as we're talking right now, it's going to be in a matter of days, Mark. The National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is a gun rights advocacy organization, has already announced their intent to sue and challenge this law as unconstitutional, or at least in violation of the federal law, both.
So it'd really be a question of, it's not a question so much of shutting down gun crime, which I guess is the ostensible reason for doing so within New York, but it's to shut down the ability of people to produce and therefore purchase guns nationally because of the risk involved in litigation.
That's either the purpose of the law or just the delicious icing on the cake for Mr. Cuomo and Ms. James. It's hard to tell.
Now, Eric Adams looks set to be the new, well, with the 7-1 outranking of Democrats to Republicans in New York City.
Before we talk about Mr. Adams, Mark, I'd like to mention one other aspect of the Governor Cuomo's package that he talked about.
Please.
And this was the this made a couple headlines about him joking about Donald Trump saying we're going to build a big wall. And he said we're going to wage a border war against the southern states because that's where the guns come from. Now, in the strictest sense, that's true. Most firearms that are recovered in New York, or at least many of an outsized portion of the firearms that are recovered from crimes in New York, originate in the southern states because it's generally easier to buy a firearm in the southern states than it is in New York. But I think it's now most of the heroin or most of the cocaine comes from Colombia, probably. But if you blew Colombia off the map, it would still come from somewhere. I think is the sort of how you would think about it. So the thing that kind of troubles me, though, Mark, is to treat visitors to New York State from South Carolina or Virginia differently than you treat visitors to New York from Wisconsin is illegal. It violates the Constitution. So I didn't hear any reporters challenge Governor Cuomo on what part of this border war he's going to implement and how it will be constitutional. But I just think it's something that we need to keep our eyes on as these promises turn into policy.
Many thanks, Scott D. Cosenza.
Thanks, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's Liberty Nation Radio. I want to thank you, the faithful listeners, our guests, Scott Cosenza, Jeff Charles, and Pinnell Bird for joining us here on the Radio America Network. We'll be back the same time, the same place next week with a very special edition. Until then, go forth and claim your liberties and freedoms guaranteed to you by the United States Constitution. Let's remember the wise words written by author Virginia Woolf. Lock up your libraries if you like, but there is no gate, no lock, no bolt that you can set upon the freedom of the mind. Thanks very much. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Who are we? We are Americans that believe in liberty. We are a project of the nonprofit One Generation Away. We are patriots who apply the founding principles to the issues of today.
And they keep moving the goalposts on us.
We are educators and commentators who love America and the Constitution. Who are we? We are Liberty Nation.